The Texas sun felt like a judgment. It beat down on the wagon, and Ayanna Mackenzie felt every single ray burning through the canvas, straight into her soul. Her copper curls were plastered to her neck, and the fancy ribbons her mother had tied felt like a noose. She was 19 years old, with freckles dotting her porcelain skin and eyes the color of new spring leaves. But today those eyes held a storm, a fire, and a terror so deep it felt like drowning. She stared out at the endless prairie grass, a golden sea leading her to hell. "You must understand, daughter." Her father's voice was gravel, trying to sound reasonable. "This alliance, it secures our future." The words were poison. Ayanna turned, her jaw so tight it ached. "Future? You've sold me. You've traded me for protection, like a sack of grain." The venom in her voice, barely a whisper, made Colonel James Mackenzie flinch. He was a military man, used to giving orders that sent men to their deaths. But the look in his daughter's eyes was a battle he couldn't win. "The Comanche will protect us from the Apache," he insisted, his voice heavy. "It's for the greater good." "My good?" she shot back. "What protection will I have? I'll be a stranger among savages, a piece of a treaty." He sighed, the sound lost in the creak of the wagon wheels. "Ayanna, I've met the warrior. Tahu. He's not what you think. He's honorable." Honorable? The word was a joke. Through the canvas she could see them. The Comanche escort, painted warriors on powerful horses, moving like ghosts across the plains. They were magnificent. They were terrifying. And one of them was to be her husband. But Tahu wasn't just any warrior. She had learned his name. In Comanche it meant deer, a cruel irony, because everyone, settler and native alike, knew him by another title. A name spoken in hushed tones around campfires, a name that promised an ending. They called him the Omega. The stories said he was the last line of defense, the one who stood when everyone else had fallen, the one who held the line, alone against impossible odds, the Omega. Because where he stood, the battle ended. For his enemies, their world ended. He was a living legend, a force of nature carved into the shape of a man, solitary, unyielding, and now he was hers. Or rather, she was his. The wagon rolled on, carrying her deeper into the land of her nightmares. The endless prairie gave way to rolling hills. In the distance, smoke curled into the sky. Her stomach twisted into a knot of pure dread. "There," her father said, his voice a strange mix of relief and fear. The village. It was larger than she'd imagined. Dozens of teepees stood in perfect, deliberate circles. It wasn't a camp. It was a fortress. And at the edge of it, a figure stood waiting. Even from a distance, he was immense. A giant among men, his shadow stretching long in the afternoon sun. He towered over the other warriors, his presence a physical weight on the landscape. This had to be him. This had to be the Omega. As the wagon creaked to a halt, the giant stepped forward, and Ayanna got her first real look at Tahu. He was 6.5 feet of solid muscle, a man built for war. His chest was a wall of sculpted power, his arms corded with the strength of 1,000 drawn bows. Tattoos of sharp geometric lines covered his skin, stories of battles won and enemies vanquished. A necklace of bear claws rested against his collarbone. But it was his face that stole her breath, carved from stone, with high cheekbones and a jaw that could cut glass. And his eyes. His eyes were black pits of intensity, and they were locked on her. He didn't look at her like a bride. He looked at her like a new weapon, assessing its edge, its weight, its potential for breaking. There was no welcome in that gaze, only evaluation. The ceremonies were a blur, gifts were exchanged, words were spoken. Her father sealed her fate with a handshake, his palms sweating against the Comanche chiefs. Tahu remained silent through it all, a thundercloud of a man radiating silent power. When he was finally introduced, he stepped so close she could feel the heat rolling off his skin. His voice was a low rumble, like rocks grinding together. "Ayanna," he said, the name sounding foreign and strange on his tongue. He didn't say it meant eternal blossom. He didn't offer a single word of comfort. He just stared at her, his eyes stripping her bare. Then he gestured to a small withered plant near the teepee entrance. "All blossoms fade," he said, his voice flat and cold. And in that moment, Ayana knew. Her father's talk of honor was a lie. This wasn't a marriage, it was a sentence. The celebratory feast felt like a funeral. Ayana sat beside Tahu, a chasm of silence between them. He didn't speak to her, didn't look at her. He ate, his movements precise and deadly, while his warriors laughed and told stories around them. Every so often, his dark eyes would flick to her, a cold, calculating gaze that made her skin crawl. He wasn't her husband. He was her jailer. When the night grew late, he stood. Without a word, he offered his hand. It was not a request. It was a command. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she placed her trembling fingers in his massive palm. His grip was like iron. The walk to their teepee was the longest of her life. Inside, a small fire cast dancing shadows across the furs that made up their bed. He led her to the center of the space and let go. The silence was suffocating. He moved to the entrance flap, not to give her space, but to seal it shut. He tied the leather cords with a finality that echoed in her soul. He was locking her in. He turned back to face her, his massive frame blocking the only exit. The firelight flickered across his tattooed chest, making the stark pattern seem to move, to writhe. "This is not a marriage," he said, his voice a low growl that vibrated through the floor. "This is a test." Ayana stared, her mind reeling. "A test? Your people are weak," he stated, as if it were a simple fact of nature. "Your father offers an alliance, but promises are wind. I will know if your people have the strength to stand with us, and I will learn it from you." He took a step closer. She instinctively took a step back. "You have one moon," he continued, his voice dropping even lower, becoming something more dangerous. "Until the moon is full again, you will prove your worth. You will work. You will bleed. You will show me you are not as soft as the man who sired you." Her breath hitched. "And if I don't?" A dark, cruel smile touched his lips for the first time. It was not a pleasant sight. "If you fail," he said softly, "the treaty is broken. The alliance is dust. And when the Apache ride against your settlements, we will watch them burn." The threat hung in the air, thick and choking. This wasn't about their union. It was about the survival of her entire world. Her failure would mean the death of everyone she had ever known. Her friend Mary, the children she used to play with, her own parents. All of it rested on her shoulders. He didn't touch her. He didn't have to. He moved to one side of the teepee and lay down on the furs, turning his back to her as if she were nothing. A piece of furniture, an object under observation. Aina stood frozen in the center of the teepee, the firelight casting her long, lonely shadow against the wall. She was trapped, a pawn in a game she didn't understand, with a monster who held the fate of hundreds in his hands. And he had just started the clock. Dawn came, not with gentle light, but with a harsh, demanding reality. Tahu was gone before she woke, leaving only the cold impression of his body on the furs. The teepee felt less like a home and more like a cage. When she finally gathered the courage to step outside, the village was already a hive of activity, and every eye was on her. There were no welcoming smiles, only suspicion. A woman named Shepi, whose eyes held a particular sharpness, approached her. Shepi's face was a mask of contempt. "The Omega's white woman," she said, the words a clear insult. "You are to tan the hides. Do not ruin them." She was led to a scraping rack where a fresh buffalo hide was stretched tight. The work was brutal. The sun beat down, the smell was overwhelming, and the tools were heavy and awkward in her hands. Her soft, uncalloused skin was rubbed raw within the first hour. The other women worked nearby, their movements efficient and practiced, their silent judgment a constant weight upon her. Tahu was nowhere to be seen, but she could feel his presence. She knew he was watching, somewhere, assessing, waiting for her to break. Days bled into a miserable routine. Every morning brought a new, back-breaking task. Hauling water from the creek, grinding corn until her shoulders screamed, mending clothes with fingers that were clumsy and sore. Every task was a failure. The water pots were too heavy, the corn was too coarse, her stitches were uneven. And Chepi was always there, her voice dripping with scorn, pointing out every mistake to the others. Ayana was an outcast. The children who had once looked at her with curiosity now shied away. The elders ignored her. She was a ghost in their camp, a symbol of a fragile, untrustworthy alliance. At night she would collapse onto her furs, her body aching, her spirit bruised. Tahu would enter the teepee long after she was pretending to sleep, the scent of wood smoke and leather filling the small space. He never spoke a word. He just lay down, a silent, menacing presence in the dark. One afternoon, while she was trying to repair a moccasin, Cheppy strode over and snatched it from her hands. "You are useless," she spat, holding up the uneven sewing for all to see. "You will bring weakness. You will bring death. The Omega should have left you in the dust." She threw the moccasin at Ayana's feet and stalked away, a satisfied smirk on her face. Tears of frustration and shame burned Ayana's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not break. She would not give him the satisfaction. She picked up the moccasin and, with trembling fingers, pulled the stitches out to start again. That evening, as she was gathering firewood at the edge of the woods, a twig snapped behind her. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. It was Mape, the young warrior she'd seen Tahu training. He looked nervous, glancing back towards the village. "He is not cruel," Mape whispered, his English hesitant. "The Omega. He is testing your spirit, not your hands." Before she could ask what he meant, he pressed something into her palm. It was a small, sharp piece of flint, perfectly shaped for scraping hides. "Use this," he said, "not the dull bone they gave you." And then he was gone, melting back into the trees. The next day at the scraping rack, Ayana used the flint. It was like night and day. The tool fit her hand, and the edge was sharp, making the work faster, cleaner. For the first time, she finished her task before the other women. Cheppy watched her, her eyes narrowed with suspicion, a new kind of hatred dawning in her expression. Ayana was learning. She started watching the other women, mimicking their movements, learning the rhythm of their work. Her hands toughened, her muscles strengthened. She was still an outcast, but she was no longer failing. She was surviving, but survival wasn't enough. She had to prove her worth. One evening, a storm rolled in, a fierce Texas thunderstorm that shook the very ground. Rain lashed down, and a bolt of lightning struck a tall pine at the edge of the camp. The tree exploded into flames. The wind whipped the fire, sending embers flying towards the teepees. Panic erupted. Warriors shouted, trying to organize a response. But the wind was too strong, the fire too fast. It was chaos. Ayana saw a shower of sparks land on the roof of a teepee near the edge of the camp, the dwelling of an old woman who was too frail to move quickly. No one else seemed to notice, too busy fighting the main blaze. Without thinking, Ayana ran. She grabbed a heavy buffalo hide that was curing nearby and scrambled up the side of the teepee. The leather was slick with rain, her footing precarious. She reached the top just as the sparks began to smolder, and she threw the heavy, wet hide over the flames, smothering them. She slid back down, landing hard on the muddy ground, her lungs heaving. And when she looked up, she saw him, Tahu, standing in the rain, watching her. His face was unreadable, a mask of stone in the flickering firelight. But for a single fleeting second, she thought she saw something in his eyes, something other than cold assessment. Then he turned and was gone, swallowed by the chaos of the storm. The fire was eventually brought under control. The next morning, the village was a mess of mud and charred wood. As Ayana was clearing debris, the old woman whose home she had saved hobbled over. The woman, whose name was Tala, pressed a small, intricately beaded bracelet into Ayana's hand. She said nothing, but her eyes, old and wise, conveyed a gratitude that spoke louder than words. It was the first kindness she had received in weeks. But something had shifted. Later that day, as she worked, she noticed Cheppy whispering with two other women, casting venomous looks in her direction. Ayana's small victory had not earned her respect. It had earned her an enemy. That night, Tahu came into the teepee and, for the first time, he spoke. "You were brave," he said. The two words hung in the air between them. "I did what anyone would have done," she replied, her voice quiet. He was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "No, not anyone." He moved closer, and her breath caught. He reached out, not to touch her, but to point at the beaded bracelet on her wrist. "Tala does not give gifts lightly. You have earned her respect." He turned to leave the teepee, but at the flap he paused. "Do not mistake respect for safety," he warned, his voice a low growl. "There are vipers in this grass. Not all of them are Apache." The warning sent a chill down her spine. He knew about Chepi. He knew, and he was letting it happen. The test wasn't just about work. It was about surviving the hatred of his people. A few days later, Ayana was sent to gather medicinal herbs from the hills outside the village. Tala had given her careful instructions, showing her which plants to pick and which to avoid. It was a task of trust, a sign of her growing acceptance. But as she wandered further from the camp, a sense of unease settled over her. The woods were too quiet. Suddenly, an arrow whistled past her head, embedding itself in a tree trunk beside her. It wasn't a Comanche arrow. The fletching was wrong. It was Apache. Ambush. War cries erupted from the rocks above. Raiders poured down the hillside, their faces painted for battle. Ayana screamed, turning to run back to the village. But they were too close. One of the warriors grabbed her, his hand tangling in her copper hair, pulling her back. She fought, kicking and scratching, but he was too strong. He threw her to the ground, a knife flashing in his hand. This was it. This was her end. She had failed the test. Her people were doomed. But then, a sound like a thunderclap echoed through the trees. Tahu. He exploded from the woods like an avenging spirit. He was not the silent, watchful man from the village. This was the Omega, a whirlwind of destruction. His war club was a blur, and the Apache warriors standing over her simply ceased to exist. Tahu stood over her, his chest heaving, his eyes blazing with a fire she had never seen before. It wasn't coldness. It was rage, a terrifying, protective fury. More Apache swarmed him, but it was like watching wolves try to take down a grizzly bear. He was unstoppable, a force of nature. In the chaos, Ayana scrambled back, her eyes wide with terror and awe. And that's when she saw it, something that made her blood run cold. One of the attackers moving at the edge of the fight was not Apache. He was a white man. He wore the familiar buckskins of a frontier scout. And as he turned his head, she saw his face clearly. It was Corporal Davies, one of her father's most trusted men. The man who had been part of her escort to the Comanche village. The world tilted on its axis. The raid. The alliance. The marriage. It was all a lie. Her father hadn't sent her to make peace. He had sent her here to die. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The treaty was a sham, a diversion. Her father wasn't protecting the settlements from the Apache. He was working with them. He had used his own daughter as a Trojan horse, a distraction while he orchestrated the destruction of the Comanche from within. Corporal Davies saw her looking. He saw the recognition in her eyes. His face paled and then hardened. He raised his rifle, not at Tahu, but at her. He had to silence her. He couldn't let the secret get out. Time slowed down. She saw the flash from the rifle's muzzle. She heard the crack of the shot. She braced for the impact, for the end, but it never came. Tahu had moved with impossible speed. He threw himself in front of her, his massive body shielding hers. He let out a grunt of pain as the bullet tore through his shoulder. The impact staggered him, but he didn't fall. He turned, his eyes locking onto Davies, and the look in them was not of a man, but of something primal, something that promised a death so terrible it would be sung about in horror stories for generations. "Run!" Tahu growled at her, his voice tight with pain. "Get to the village. Warn them." But it was too late. More raiders, both Apache and white, were pouring out of the woods. They weren't just a raiding party. It was an army. They were surrounding the village. This wasn't an ambush. It was an extermination. Tahu shoved her behind a rock. "Stay down," he commanded. He was bleeding heavily, but he stood his ground, his war club ready. He was the Omega, the last line of defense, and the last line had been drawn right here. The fighting was brutal. Tahu was a demon, but he was just one man, already wounded. The attackers were flooding the valley. Ayana watched in horror as Comanche warriors, drawn out by the sounds of the fight, were cut down by the overwhelming force. The village was being besieged, and it was all her fault. She was the harbinger of this apocalypse. In the chaos, Davies was organizing the attack, directing the raiders with military precision. He wanted her dead, but he wanted the Comanche wiped out more. Tahu was a legend, but even legends can bleed. Even legends can die. Ayana knew she had a choice. She could stay hidden and pray for a miracle. Or she could do something. She remembered Mape's words. He is testing your spirit, not your hands. All her life she had been a colonel's daughter, pampered, protected. Now she was the wife of the Omega, and she would not let him die alone. She saw a fallen warrior's bow and a quiver of arrows lying on the ground nearby. Her father had insisted she learn archery, calling it a civilized pastime for a young lady. She had hated it, but now her fingers closed around the familiar shape of the bow. She took a deep breath, knocked an arrow, and rose from behind the rock. She sighted down the shaft, her target clear. Not an Apache warrior, not a random raider. She aimed directly at Corporal Davies, the man who had betrayed them all, the man who had smiled at her in the wagon just weeks ago, the man who was the key to this whole nightmare. She let the arrow fly. It struck Davies in the leg, just above the knee. He screamed, dropping his rifle and crashing to the ground. The sudden loss of their commander threw the attacking force into momentary confusion. It was a tiny window, but it was enough. Tahu saw what she had done. He looked at her, and in his eyes, through the pain and the fury, she saw it again. That spark, but this time it wasn't surprise. It was pride. He used the brief lull to unleash hell. He fought his way to her, cutting a path through their enemies. He grabbed her arm, his grip like steel despite his wound. "The creek!" he yelled over the din of battle. "There is a cave behind the waterfall. Go!" "I'm not leaving you," she screamed back. "This is not a request," he roared, his face a mask of desperation. "You are the only one who knows the truth. You must survive. You must tell them what your father has done. Now go." He shoved her toward the trees, then turned to face the oncoming tide of enemies. He stood alone, wounded, between her and an entire army. He was buying her time, with his life. This was the true meaning of Omega, not the end of his enemies. It was the end of himself for the sake of his people, for the sake of the truth, for her. Ayana ran. Tears streamed down her face, mingling with the dirt and blood. She ran through the woods, the sounds of battle fading behind her. She didn't know if she was running towards safety or just delaying the inevitable. But she knew one thing. She would not let his sacrifice be in vain. She would survive, and she would make her father pay. She found the cave behind the waterfall just as Tahu had described. It was small, damp, and hidden. She huddled in the darkness, listening to the roar of the water and the distant echoes of a battle she could no longer see. Hours passed. The sounds of fighting slowly died down, replaced by an eerie, unnatural silence. She didn't know if Tahu was alive or dead. She didn't know if the village had survived. All she knew was that she was alone, hunted, and carrying a truth that could either save both their peoples or get her killed. When dawn broke, she crept out of the cave. The air was thick with the smell of smoke. Her heart pounded as she made her way back toward the village. She had to know. The sight that greeted her was one of utter devastation. The village was a smoldering ruin. Teepees were burned to the ground, the bodies of warriors and raiders alike scattered across the churned-up earth. It was a scene from a nightmare, a graveyard. She searched frantically for Tahu, her throat tight with a grief so profound it felt like a physical weight. She found Mape, the young warrior lying near the edge of the woods, his lifeblood soaking into the ground. He was barely alive. "He held them," Mape rasped, his eyes struggling to focus on her. "The Omega. He held the pass to the west. He sent the women and children to escape. He saved us." "Where is he?" Ayana begged, tears blurring her vision. Mape shook his head slowly. "He did not fall. They took him. Your people. They took him." The words were a dagger in her heart. Taken. Not dead. Alive. A prisoner. Her father had him. A new kind of horror, colder and sharper than grief, washed over her. Her father wouldn't keep Tahu alive for long. He was a loose end. A legend who had to be erased. She had to get to him. But how? She was one woman against her father's soldiers and his Apache allies. As she knelt there trying to figure out what to do, she heard a sound. Horses. She dove for cover, peering through the bushes. It was a group of settlers, not soldiers. Farmers with hunting rifles and grim, determined faces. They were led by William Hayes, the territorial representative. And with them was her childhood friend, Mary Henderson, the one whose settlement was supposed to have been attacked. "Ayanna!" Mary cried, spotting her. She ran forward, throwing her arms around her. "We saw the smoke. We came as fast as we could. What happened here?" Ayanna pulled back, her mind racing. Could she trust them? Her own father had betrayed her. Who was to say these people weren't part of his plan? "My father," Ayanna said, her voice shaking but firm. "He did this. He's been working with the Apache. This whole treaty was a lie." The settlers stared at her, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief. "That's a terrible accusation, Ayanna," William Hayes said cautiously. "Colonel Mackenzie is a respected man." "Respected?" Ayanna's voice rose, laced with hysterical laughter. "He sent me here to die. He used me to distract the Comanche while his men and the Apache prepared this massacre. One of his own men, Corporal Davies, led the attack." Just then, one of the settlers called out, "Over here! We found a survivor!" They rushed over. It was Tala, the old woman. She was wounded, but alive, hidden beneath a pile of buffalo hides. Her eyes found Ayanna's. "She speaks the truth," Tala said, her voice weak but clear. "The white soldier. He led them. The Omega fought to save us. They have taken him." Mary looked from Tala's earnest face to Ayanna's tear-streaked one. She saw the truth there. "I believe her," Mary said firmly, turning to the other settlers. "My husband and we were warned a week ago, not by the army, but by a Comanche scout. He said a great evil was coming, wearing the face of a friend. We didn't understand. Now we do." A ripple of unease went through the group of men. They were simple farmers and ranchers. They had trusted Colonel Mackenzie to protect them. The idea that he had betrayed them, allied himself with their most feared enemy, was unthinkable. Yet the evidence was all around them. The massacre, the testimony of two women from opposite worlds. "What do we do?" one of the farmers asked, his voice shaking with anger. Ayanna stood up, wiping the tears from her face. The fear was still there, but something else was growing in its place. A cold, hard resolve. She was no longer just a colonel's daughter. She was the wife of the Omega warrior, and they had her husband. "We get him back," she said, her voice ringing with an authority she didn't know she possessed. "My father's fort is 2 days' ride from here. That's where they'll have taken him. He'll have Davies there, too. They'll be planning their next move, thinking they've won." "We can't attack an army fort," Hayes protested. "We're just farmers." "We won't have to," Ayanna said, her mind working faster than it ever had before. "The women and children Tahu saved. Where did they go?" Tala pointed west. "To the hidden canyon, a place of sanctuary." "Then that's where we go first," Ayanna declared. "The Comanche have lost their homes, their warriors. They'll be scattered, leaderless. But they won't be broken. Their rage will be a fire waiting for a spark, and I'm going to be that spark." She looked at the faces of the settlers around her, men who had feared the Comanche their whole lives. "My father betrayed you too. He left your homes unprotected. He made a deal with the devil and gambled with your lives. This isn't a Comanche fight anymore. It's our fight. We stand together, or we fall apart." It was a crazy plan. A handful of farmers and a group of grieving Comanche women and children against a corrupt cavalry officer and an Apache war band. The odds were impossible. But looking at the smoking ruins of the village, thinking of Tahu in chains, Ayanna knew there was no other choice. For the first time, a real alliance was being forged. Not in a treaty room with ink and paper, but here in the ashes of betrayal, with blood and a shared thirst for justice. Ayanna, the girl who had been sold like cattle, was about to lead an army. The journey to the hidden canyon was grim. Ayanna led the small band of settlers, her heart a cold stone in her chest. When they arrived, they found a scene of profound grief. The surviving Comanche, mostly women, children, and the elderly, were mourning their dead. Their anger was a palpable force, a simmering volcano of hate directed at all white people. When they saw Ayanna and the settlers, they raised their weapons. It was only Tala's intervention that prevented bloodshed. "This one is different," Tala cried, pointing a trembling finger at Ayana. She carries the spirit of the Omega. Her people did not do this. Her own father, a great chief of the soldiers, betrayed us all. Ayana stepped forward, facing the sea of hostile faces. She told them everything. About her father's treachery, about Corporal Davies, about the ambush and Tahu's capture. She spoke of his sacrifice, of how he had sent them to safety while he stayed to face an army. When she finished, Chepi, her face streaked with tears and dirt, stepped forward. Her hatred for Ayana was gone, replaced by a shared burning grief. "They have our war chief," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "What would you have us do? We have no warriors left." "You have me," Ayana said, her voice ringing with newfound strength. "And you have them." She gestured to the settlers. "They were betrayed too. We have a common enemy, a common cause." She looked around at the faces, Comanche and settler alike. "I know I am not Comanche. I know I am an outsider. But I am Tahu's wife. And I will not let the man who saved all of you rot in my father's prison. We will get him back. And we will have justice." A fire was lit. The grief began to transform into a unified rage. Over the next day, they planned. Ayana's knowledge of the fort, combined with the Comanche's knowledge of the land, created a daring strategy. It wasn't about a frontal assault. It was about infiltration and turning their enemy's strength into a weakness. 2 days later, under the cover of a moonless night, a strange army gathered in the hills overlooking Fort Mackenzie. It was a force born of desperation, a dozen settler marksmen and 30 Comanche women who, while not warriors, knew how to handle a knife and bow with deadly efficiency. They were armed with rage and the element of surprise. Their plan had two parts. The settlers, led by Mary's husband, would create a diversion, setting fires at the far side of the fort to draw the bulk of the soldiers out. During the chaos, Ayana, Chepi, and a small group of the quietest Comanche women would scale the rear wall and get to the stockade where Tahu was being held. It was suicide, but it was their only chance. As the first flames erupted on the far side of the fort, shouts of alarm filled the night. Soldiers scrambled from the barracks, just as they'd planned. Ayana's heart pounded as she and her small team threw their ropes over the palisade. They climbed, silent as shadows, their movements fueled by adrenaline. They dropped down inside the fort. The central yard was chaotic. Ayana led them through the shadows, her knowledge of the layout guiding them directly to the stockade. 2 guards stood outside a small, heavily barred cell. Before the guards could even react, Chepi and another woman were on them, knives flashing in the dim light. The guards fell without a sound. Ayana stared at the man inside the cell. It was Tahu. He was chained to the wall, his head bowed. He was bruised and bloody, but he was alive. "Tahu," she whispered through the bars. His head shot up. His eyes, even in the darkness, burned with a fierce light when he saw her. For a moment, disbelief warred with hope on his face. "Ayana," he breathed, the name a prayer. "You are alive." "I told you I wasn't leaving you," she said, her voice choked with emotion as she worked frantically on the lock with a tool one of the women had brought. The lock clicked open. Chepi and the others broke the chains with a heavy bar. Tahu stumbled out, his massive frame unsteady. He reached for Ayana, his hand gently touching her face, as if to confirm she was real. But the moment was shattered by a voice. "Well, well, a family reunion." Ayana spun around. Corporal Davies stood there, a smug grin on his face, flanked by a dozen soldiers. Her father, Colonel Mackenzie, stood behind them, his face a cold mask of fury. "It seems the rat came back for its trap," her father said, his voice dripping with contempt. "Did you really think it would be that easy, daughter?" They were surrounded, trapped. The diversion had failed. It had been a trap within a trap. "You won't get away with this," Ayana spat, standing protectively in front of the wounded Tahu. "My dear girl, I already have," her father said with a chilling smile. "The Apache are wiping out the last of the renegade Comanche as we speak. The territorial governor will praise me as a hero who ended the native wars once and for all. And you will be the tragic daughter, killed by the savages she tried to befriend. A sad story, but a necessary one." Davies raised his rifle, pointing it directly at Ayana's heart. "Any last words, traitor?" Tahu moved, placing himself in front of Ayana, shielding her with his body once again. Even wounded and unarmed, he was an intimidating presence. "You will have to kill me first," he growled. "That was always the plan," the colonel said calmly. "Kill him, then her." But as Davis's finger tightened on the trigger, a new sound cut through the night. Not the sound of battle, the sound of a cavalry bugle playing the charge. But it wasn't coming from inside the fort. It was coming from outside. The main gates of the fort exploded inwards. Soldiers on horseback poured into the courtyard, their uniforms clean, their movements precise. They weren't her father's ragtag militia. This was the United States Army, and at their head was a man Ayana recognized. General Croft, her father's commanding officer. Colonel Mackenzie's face went white. "General, what is the meaning of this?" General Croft's face was like granite. He ignored the colonel and looked straight at Ayana. "William Hayes and a group of settlers reached my command post an hour ago, ma'am. They told me a rather disturbing story. I came to see for myself." His eyes swept over the scene. The imprisoned Comanche chief, the traitorous corporal, the colonel standing with his guns aimed at his own daughter. "Mackenzie," the general's voice was ice. "You are relieved of your command. You are under arrest for treason." Chaos erupted. Her father's men, realizing they were caught, tried to fight. But they were outnumbered and outmatched. In the ensuing confusion, Davies saw his chance to escape. He lunged for Ayana, grabbing her, using her as a shield. "Nobody move, or she dies!" he screamed, pressing a knife to her throat. But he had made a fatal mistake. He had forgotten who he was dealing with. Tahu, moving with a speed that should have been impossible for a man so wounded, closed the distance in 2 strides. He grabbed Davies' knife arm, and Ayana heard a sickening crack of bone. The knife clattered to the ground. Tahu wasn't finished. He lifted the screaming corporal off the ground with one hand, his eyes burning with the cold fury of the Omega. "You are not worthy of a warrior's death," Tahu growled, and with a single powerful motion, he threw Davies into the wall of the stockade. The man collapsed in a heap, broken and unconscious. The fight was over. Justice had come. Not in the way Ayana had planned, but it had come. As soldiers secured her father and his men, Ayana turned to Tahu. She gently touched the bullet wound in his shoulder. "You're hurt," she whispered. He looked down at her, his dark eyes filled with an emotion so powerful it took her breath away. "It is nothing," he said, his voice husky. "You came back for me." "Always," she replied. In the aftermath, the full extent of her father's treachery was revealed. He had been secretly selling government land to railroad barons, and the Apache and Comanche were simply in his way. He had planned to use the war he created as cover to eliminate them both, framing the Comanche for attacks on settlers that he and his Apache allies were actually carrying out. He would have been a hero and a very rich man, but he hadn't counted on his daughter. He hadn't counted on her spirit, and he hadn't counted on the Omega. 3 months later, Ayana stood at the edge of the rebuilt Comanche village. It was different now. Several settler families, including Mary's, had chosen to build their new homes here, alongside the Comanche. A new community was being forged, built on the ashes of betrayal and cemented by shared sacrifice. Tahu came to stand behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist. His shoulder had healed, leaving behind a new scar to add to his collection, a scar he had gotten for her. "They are calling you a hero," he murmured into her hair. She leaned back against his solid chest. "They call you a legend." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My name, Omega, meant the end. I was the one who stood alone when all was lost. But you have given it a new meaning." He gently placed his large hand over her stomach, where a new life was just beginning to grow. "You have made me a beginning." She turned in his arms to face him, reaching up to touch his face. The face she had once feared was now the dearest thing in the world to her. "And you, my husband, have shown me what true strength is." She smiled, a real, radiant smile. "I used to be overwhelmed by the size of you, your strength, your power. But now I understand. I was never meant to be overwhelmed by it. I was meant to match it." His eyes darkened with love and admiration. "And so you have, my eternal blossom," he whispered. "So you have." Their love had been forged in fire and betrayal, a bond stronger than any treaty. The red-haired woman and the Omega warrior had not just found each other. They had created a new world together, a legacy of courage that would echo for generations. What a journey we've witnessed together. From a forced marriage to a heroic stand, from utter betrayal to a love that built a new world. But let me ask you this. When Ayanna decided to lead that impossible attack on the fort, was it courage or foolishness? In her shoes, would you have risked everything for one person, even if it meant facing your own father on the battlefield? And what about Tahu? His title, the Omega, was one of fear, but he turned it into a symbol of ultimate sacrifice. Does true strength lie in being an unstoppable force, or in being the one willing to stand and fall so that others can survive? Think about the moment Ayanna fired that arrow. The moment Tahu took a bullet for her, the moment she chose to unite two peoples instead of letting them be consumed by hate. These choices weren't easy. They were decisions born from the darkest of circumstances that redefined who they were and what they were capable of. If you believe that the greatest heroes are forged in the hottest fires, and that true love isn't just found, but built through courage and sacrifice, then subscribe to our channel. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that even when you face impossible odds, the strength of your spirit can change the world. Every subscription helps us continue to bring you tales of resilience, justice, and the unbreakable power of the human heart. What did you think of the final confrontation between Ayanna and her father? Let us know in the comments below. We read every single one, and your thoughts are what inspire our next story.